They tied her to a post and priced her at $3. No name, no mercy, just dust in her mouth and strangers looking away. He stepped forward, paid without a word, and led her home. Next morning, 4 teacups steamed on the porch, one finally placed before the woman no one had ever made room for. Part 1. Mountain Woman, $3. Red dust wasn't much more than a crossroad of wind and wood, a stretch of false fronts, cracked windows, and boots that knew more dust than shine. Midday sun spilled down mean and bright, painting everything in white heat and silence. Even the horses tied out front of Kavanaugh's general store stood quieter than usual, as if they too knew this day wasn't a regular one. They'd posted her at the center of town near the old water trough. Not tied, not chained, but she might as well have been. A wooden crate made a crude seat, and a sun-bleached sign nailed into the post above her read, "Mountain Woman, $3. That was all it said. No name, no explanation, no one asked. She sat still, arms folded around a small deerskin pouch, worn smooth by years and handling. Her dress was threadbare but not filthy, patched with odd bits of cloth. Old flour sacks, maybe. And her boots had long since surrendered to the elements. What hadn't surrendered was her posture, straight spine, chin set. She didn't glance up when someone spat too close, didn't flinch when old man Deaver chuckled and said, "Might be she bites." The crowd had gathered in that way towns do, not with purpose, but with the slow curiosity of people looking for something to do, something to look at that wasn't their own loneliness. "She's one of them mountain women, I'd bet," whispered a woman from the milliner's porch. "Wild sort. Heard they brew poison from moss and speak to owls." "She speaks?" a man asked, chewing tobacco so old it barely clung to his teeth. "Hasn't said a damn word since sunup." Eli Bannon arrived near the tail end of it all, riding a quiet sorrel and hauling 2 bags of barley flour behind his saddle. He didn't come for the spectacle. He never did. The man avoided town unless absolutely necessary. He wore solitude like a coat, patched, comfortable, and not up for trade. His boots hit the ground with a slow thud, and he tied his horse near the livery with methodical hands. Some noticed, most didn't. He was a widower with 2 young children, lived up on Crescent Hill in the old cabin with the wind-stained porch and overgrown fence lines. Folks called him quiet, which was a polite way of saying he didn't drink with them, didn't gossip with them, and didn't answer questions not worth asking. Eli walked toward the woman, not fast, not hesitant either, just a steady stride like a man who's made peace with decisions before he ever reaches them. 3 silver dollars clinked into the dust beside her boot. No one said a word. The air thickened like storm-bent branches, about to crack. The woman's eyes, slate gray, unreadable, finally lifted. Eli Bannon didn't smile, didn't take his hat off, just said, "If you can walk, come with me." There was no pity in his voice, no hunger either, just a quiet offer, and flat as the land around them. She didn't answer. She stood. Her knees wobbled a bit, but she didn't ask for help. She didn't even dust off her skirt. Just picked up that little leather pouch, tucked it to her side, and followed him past the gaping faces, down the lane, toward the sorrel waiting with the barley. "Who the hell does that?" one man muttered, breaking the stillness. No one had an answer. By the time they mounted and rode out, the wind had picked up. Dust covered the words on the sign. And when young Billy Cade walked over to kick the wooden crate she'd sat on, he found something carved faintly on the underside of the seat. Letters so small they'd nearly faded, but no one bothered to read it. Back on Crescent Hill, the chimney smoke was just beginning to curl. James and Mary, Eli's 2, boy of 9, girl just turned 7, stood barefoot on the porch watching the trail like they always did. When he was gone, When they saw the second horse, their eyes narrowed. When they saw the rider behind him, their eyes dropped. The woman didn't wave, didn't look. She followed Eli through the gate that stuck, past the fence half-built, to the cabin that creaked in the wind like it remembered grief better than laughter. Inside, the air smelled of ash and something faintly herbal, old tea maybe. The children stepped aside as she passed, silent as deer near a moving shadow. Eli placed the flower on the counter, then poured a cup of water from the tin basin and handed it to her. She took it without thanks. Drink. Sat near the fire. She hadn't said a word since leaving Red Dust. Eli hadn't expected one. Outside, the wind dragged dusk down from the ridge. Inside, the only sound was the soft hiss of pine sap burning in the stove. That night, 3 tin cups sat on the table. 1 for Eli, 1 each for James and Mary. A 4th sat nearby. Empty, but no one reached for it. Not yet. Part 2, a cold chair and a 4th cup. Morning on Crescent Hill came slow, like a man waking after too many years alone. The sun stretched across the valley with a dusty gold, catching on the frost that clung to the cabin's eastern window. Inside, Eli was already up. Had been for a while by the look of the woodpile near the stove and the faint scent of boiled oats lingering in the corners. He didn't make noise when he moved. He didn't need to. The cabin breathed with him, wood groaning, tin kettle hissing, floorboards settling beneath calloused boots that knew their way without needing light. On the long pine table sat 3 tin cups, same as always. 1 at the head where he took his seat, 2 across from him, smaller, dented things with mismatched handles. James's had a black smudge on the rim that never came off, no matter how Mary scrubbed. Hers was lined with a strip of blue paint from some old toy she'd crushed beneath a wagon wheel last spring. The 4th cup stayed on the shelf behind the oil lamp. It had belonged to Lily, his wife, and no one had touched it in years. But that morning, Eli reached for it. He didn't say why, didn't look around to see if the children noticed. He just placed it at the far end of the table, across from him. Poured hot water over the tea leaves she'd packed herself 3 winters ago. Mountain mint and spruce tip, dried and bundled in a bit of lace. When the woman stepped out from the corner cot, hair still damp from the cloth she'd wiped her face with, shawl slung over one shoulder like a burden she refused to let go, she saw it, the cup. She didn't ask whose it was, didn't reach for it either, just pulled the shawl tighter and moved toward the window where the light caught on the edge of her cheekbone like the mountains catching snow. James and Mary sat stiff at the table, neither eating. "Go ahead," Eli said quietly. They obeyed, but slow. Mary chewed like something might crack in her mouth besides oats. James didn't look up. He never did when he was unsure. The woman didn't sit. Instead, she knelt by the hearth, opened the fire grate, and began poking at the embers. Her movements were practiced, familiar, like she'd done it 1,000 times in places colder than this, with nothing but damp pine and stubborn smoke. She added 2 logs, tilted the iron pot hanging from the hook, and tasted with a wooden spoon she pulled from her pouch. Just once. Then she nodded to herself and added a pinch of salt from the small tin nailed to the beam above the stove. No questions, no instructions, no noise, just actions, small, deliberate, necessary. Later, as Eli mended the latch on the front door, he watched her pull down the torn curtain from the back window. She examined it, rubbed the edge between 2 fingers, and disappeared outside. By noon, the fabric was rinsed and drying on a rope near the barn, patches already stitched over the worst holes, steady, tight seams. She found a brush and scrubbed the saddles, cleaned out the chicken coop without being asked, stirred the stew again and tasted, then stepped back to let the smell curl through the house. Not once did she ask where anything was. She moved through the cabin like a ghost with a map in her bones. The children trailed her in silent suspicion. They watched her from corners, from door frames, from behind Eli's chair. But she didn't reach for them, didn't speak unless she needed to. She wasn't trying to be family. She was trying to be small, invisible, maybe, useful, definitely. At dusk, Eli sat outside on the porch, whittling a splintered piece of cedar into something that might someday become a spoon. His knife moved slow, careful. He wasn't a man for carving, but he liked the rhythm of it, the way it made his hands do something when his thoughts wouldn't sit still. The woman stepped out then, stood at the porch rail. He didn't look at her, just nodded, slow and low. She nodded back, and for a moment the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was something like a truce. Behind them, Mary swept the cabin floor with her too small broom. James climbed onto the counter and stole a carrot from the stew pot, which earned him a rare look, not a glare, from the woman. Just enough to make him swallow whole and walk away sheepish. Later, the 4 cups sat on the table again. 3 filled, 1 left steaming but untouched. The woman glanced at it, then at Eli. He said nothing, just pushed the breadbasket closer to her side of the table. She didn't thank him, didn't reach, but her hand moved, slow, uncertain, and tore a piece from the corner. In the firelight, her knuckles stayed white, but she didn't let go, and that, in its own quiet way, was the start of something. Not welcome, not yet, but not exile either. Part 3. A name that froze the room. It was mid-morning when Clay Morrell rode up the hill, mule cart creaking behind him full of salt, dried beans, and the usual stack of letters no one in these parts ever seemed in a rush to answer. The sky was dry and gray as tin, wind sharp with the smell of river ice breaking far off in the canyons. He wiped his nose on a sleeve, hitched the mule to the gatepost, and trudged up toward the porch like he'd done 100 times before. Eli was on the stoop splitting kindling, shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow. His axe met wood with that clean, honest thud that said nothing needed fixing, just maintaining. "Got your post," Clay said, voice already tired. Eli nodded once. "Appreciate it." But then Clay looked past him, toward the side yard where June, though she hadn't been called that yet, was stringing fresh-washed flour sacks onto the line. Her shawl was pinned at the shoulder with a scrap of antler. The hem of her dress was still damp. There was nothing remarkable in her appearance. Until she turned, and Clay froze. The letters slipped in his hand. He stared, not rudely, not like a man seeing something pretty, but like a man recognizing a face from a place he didn't want to remember. "Lord above," he muttered. Eli caught the change, the sudden tightness in Clay's jaw. "You know her?" Clay didn't answer right away, just looked again, lips pressing thin. "She one of them. Avery's?" he asked, low and wary, like the word might call ghosts up from the ground. "From Cold Rock?" June had paused at the clothespin in her hand, but said nothing. Her back straightened, just a little. Then she went back to hanging the last towel. Clay's gaze shifted between her and Eli. "You don't know?" he asked. Eli shook his head. "Don't matter." Clay let out a sound, part scoff, part disbelief, and tossed the bundle of letters onto the porch rail. "Reckon you ought to ask what you're housing before you get the rest of the ridge burnt down." He stomped off without another word, the mule braying as if to echo the unease left behind. The silence he left didn't lift. It settled, hung in the air like a storm building over flatland, slow and too quiet to ignore. Eli didn't go inside right away. He stayed at the steps, rubbing sap from his palm, watching the woman finish her chore. She met his eyes once, didn't explain, didn't defend, didn't flinch either. Inside the cabin, Mary was brushing flour across the tabletop, trying to mimic bread making like she remembered her mama doing. James was outside stacking firewood. They didn't know what had passed, but they felt it, like animals before a thunderclap, restless, wary. By supper, nothing had been said. But everything had changed. The fourth teacup still sat in its place, but no steam rose from it that evening. The bread was cut thinner, the stew was saltier than usual. June didn't sit right away. She ladled bowls, then stood by the hearth, with her back half turned, the flames warming only one side of her. Eli watched her more closely now, not with suspicion, just with weight, like he was trying to measure something he hadn't noticed before. When she finally sat, no one spoke. James tried once, asked if he could have seconds, but Mary nudged him under the table hard enough to hush whatever else he might have said. And in that room, the sound of the spoon against the bowl was loud, startling even, like iron scraping stone. No one asked who Bo Avery was. No one brought up Cold Rock. No one had to. The name had already done what names do best out here, stirred the dust, split the room, made strangers out of people who'd almost stopped feeling like strangers. That night, after the children were in bed, Eli stepped onto the porch and lit his pipe, something he hadn't done since Lily died. He smoked without looking at the stars, just watched the curl of smoke fade into dark. Behind him he could hear the soft rustle of cloth. June, laying out her bedroll on the floor by the fire, even though there was an empty cot near the children's room. He didn't stop her, didn't offer comfort, but he left the door unlatched, in case she needed to step outside, in case she wanted to leave, in case she chose to stay. Part 4, Snowfall, a fever, and the first sign of trust. The first real snow came like a held breath finally let loose. Not flurries or drift, but a hard, silent fall that blanketed Crescent Hill like a burial cloth. It came in the night, thick and heavy, muting the world in white. The wind no longer howled. It whispered, as if even it didn't want to disturb what lay beneath. By morning, the yard was half gone under the weight of it. Fences blurred, the path to the stable erased. And inside the log cabin, breath plumed in the corners, thin as fog. James coughed in his sleep. Not a child's cough, not the kind that comes and goes with dust or hay. This one was thick in the chest, dragging like chains in the lungs. By noon his cheeks were flushed too red, his brow too damp. The boy shivered though the fire was built high, and the kettle hissed constant over the flame. Eli paced, slow, controlled, but you could see the edge in him. Every few minutes his hand would drift near the Winchester above the mantel, like instinct didn't know what else to do. June moved quieter than usual, which was saying something. She checked the boy's forehead without asking, pulled down the blankets, fetched a tin of dried bark from her pouch, and steeped it with the calm of someone who'd done it before. Not once, but many times. Willow and sage. She didn't explain, just pressed the warm cloth to James's chest, sat by him when Mary's small voice said, "I'm scared," and replied soft but sure, "Me too, but scared folks still got hands that work." She had Mary boil water and Eli chop smaller kindling for the bedroom stove. She wrung the cloth, folded the quilts tighter, rubbed James's wrists with something sharp-smelling that made the boy stir. Through it all, she never asked permission, never looked to Eli for the nod. And he didn't stop her. Not once. Outside, the snow kept falling, burying prints, wagons, trails, every sign of where anyone had been. But inside, in the cabin wrapped in storm silence, a different kind of shift was happening. Eli brought her a blanket near midnight. She took it without words, tucking it around James instead of herself. She hadn't left his side. At dawn she was still there, one hand on the boy's shoulder, the other loose across her lap. Her head had dipped forward, but she wasn't sleeping, just resting. Eli stood in the doorway. He didn't say a thing, only stepped forward and placed a steady hand on her shoulder, just once. It wasn't a gesture of thanks, or approval, or apology. It was something else. Trust, maybe. The beginning of it, anyhow. That morning, as pale light filtered in through frost-lined glass, the kitchen smelled of steeped bark and firewood. The table was already set when Mary rubbed the sleep from her eyes and came out. 3 cups, 3 chairs. But today, something was different. There were 4 cups. The 4th, plain tin, the one no one touched, had steam rising from it. And the empty chair, it had been pulled out. June didn't react when she saw it, didn't smile, didn't cry. She just sat down. Mary placed a biscuit beside her without a word. James was still asleep, but his breathing was easier, the color in his face less worrisome. Eli stirred his tea with the back of his spoon. Slow, thoughtful. The snow pressed against the cabin walls, and the world stayed hushed. But something had shifted inside these logs. Not loud, not grand. Just enough to feel it in the way a hand lingers longer on a shoulder. Or in the way a cup, once cold and unused, finally steamed. Part 5. A name given, not carried. The fever broke by midday, and James blinked up at the rafters like waking from a far-off place. His voice rasped when he called out, but June was already leaning in with a tin cup, helping him sip warm broth. She didn't speak, just nodded when he looked at her, a bit confused but no longer frightened. Mary stayed close that day, trailing June like a small, silent echo. She didn't ask questions, just helped, gathering firewood, laying out clean linen, even brushing June's skirts free of lint with her little fingers when she thought no one noticed. The sky cleared overnight, and the snow took on that pink-blue glow that only comes when the land breathes again. For a time, everything outside was soft. The pines heavy with silence, the fence posts gleaming like pewter in the light. Inside, the house moved differently, less like a place full of grief, more like one learning to live again. June swept the floors with firm strokes, patched a hole in Eli's shirt, and baked cornbread that steamed on the sill. She still hadn't said much, but when she walked, she no longer kept her back to the walls. Late one afternoon, Mary, brave in the way only small children can be, looked up from her stool in the kitchen and asked, "Miss?" "What's your name?" June froze. Her hand tightened around the tin pot. For a second, she didn't seem to breathe. Then came the slow reply. "They called me Avery." The room cooled, though the stove was going strong. She didn't say it with pride. She didn't say it like it was hers. More like someone repeating what had been carved into them, whether they wanted it or not. "Avery," she said again, quieter. "That ain't a name. Just a weight someone hung on me." Eli had been fixing a hinge on the pantry door. He stopped, didn't look up right away, then still crouched low, he said, "Then it's time you got a different one." She looked at him, really looked. Eli didn't flinch. "From now on, we'll call you June." June. It landed soft in the room, like a breeze that smelled of open fields and places unburdened. June turned the word over in her mind. She didn't say it out loud, but her shoulders straightened a little, as if trying the name on like a coat she hadn't worn in years. That evening, James took her old dented tin cup and scratched something into the side with the point of his belt buckle. "June." He handed it to her without fanfare. She ran her thumb over the marks and said almost to herself, "So that's mine now." From then on, she began teaching Mary to stitch simple patterns with leftover thread. helped James oil the saddle leather and check the bit on his pony. She started wearing her hair tied back with a strip of fabric, the way ranch women did when the work was steady and the wind came through. Eli didn't say much, but one morning he brought in a worn pair of boots from the barn, small enough for her feet, left them by the fire with no explanation. She wore them the next day. There were no toasts made, no declarations, no dinner table confessions. But you could feel it in the shared chores, in the quiet meals where no one watched the clock. They hadn't become a family overnight. They'd just stopped being strangers. And in the West, sometimes that was more honest than any wedding vow ever spoken. Part 6. Trouble rides in from red dust. It started with the sound of hooves, fast, sharp, unsettled, kicking up the frost-bitten dust on the old mule trail. Mary looked up from the porch where she was shelling peas. James dropped the kindling he'd been sorting, and June stepped out from the barn, saddle blanket over her arm, her face already tight with something she hadn't named yet, but recognized. 4 riders came into view, men from red dust, not lawmen, not friends, just the kind of men who'd heard too many rumors and were always looking for someone to blame for how mean the wind blew on their side of the hill. At the front rode Merrick Polk, big man, red scarf around his neck like it meant something. Used to sell salt and sugar from his wagon, but these days he mostly dealt in bitterness. Behind him were 2 others Eli knew by sight, not bad men, but easily stirred. And the 4th was Clay Morrell. He didn't look at June, didn't have to. He'd already told what he knew, or thought he knew. The riders pulled up short outside the porch. Their horses stamped and huffed. Eli stepped out of the doorway, slow, calm, unarmed, but not unready. "Eli," Merrick said, "heard you got yourself some company." June stood still behind the barn post, not hiding, but not showing either. "I've got hands helping me," Eli replied, quiet, "and mouths to feed." "She's an Avery," Merrick said, eyes narrowing. "You know what that means." Eli didn't flinch. "I know what it don't mean." Merrick shifted in his saddle. "We all remember Cold Rock. Fire didn't start itself. You bringing her here makes folks uneasy." Eli stepped off the porch, slow as molasses in winter. "She's not Bo Avery. She's not any of you. She's June, and she has a place here." Clay finally looked up then. There was something in his face. Not guilt exactly, but maybe the weight of words spoken too early and too loud. "No one's taking her," Eli said, and his voice was steady, firm. The wind caught the edge of his coat. His hands didn't tremble. They all knew what Eli Bannon had done during the dry summer years, how he put down a bear with one shot, how he cleared brush fire with a shovel and his bare boots. They knew he didn't talk much, but when he did, he meant it, and right now they believed him. Merrick clicked his tongue, turned his horse. "You're a stubborn man, Eli." "Been called worse." The riders turned one by one, heading back the way they came, but the dust they stirred didn't settle easy. That evening June stood at the sink, washing out the basin. Her hands moved slow, deliberate. Eli leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "They'll keep talking," he said. "I know. They might come back. I'll still be here." He didn't say thank you. She didn't ask for it. Instead, he reached for the towel, handed it to her, not touching, just offering. Her fingers brushed his as she took it. Warm, calloused, real. The fire cracked low in the stove, and outside the moon was climbing over Crescent Hill. Inside the little house, it was still, but not empty, because sometimes, in the West, holding your ground wasn't about fences or guns. It was about choosing who got to stay and standing by it no matter who came riding up the road. Part 7. The night she told the truth. The rain came hard that evening, washing down from the hills like it had something to forget. Thunder rolled somewhere off toward the ridge, low and tired. Inside the cabin it was quieter than usual. No crackling talk between the kids, no sound but the stew pot bubbling soft and slow. June sat near the fire, legs folded beneath her, a knitted shawl pulled close around her shoulders. James and Mary had gone to bed early, curled under patched quilts in the loft. Eli sat across the room, whittling a piece of mesquite into what might become a spoon, or maybe just shavings on the floor. The light from the fire licked the walls with a sleepy orange, and the kettle hummed. "Cold Rock," June said. It was the first time she'd spoken the name aloud. Eli didn't raise his eyes, but the knife in his hand stopped moving. The cabin didn't feel small, but somehow the space between them closed just the same. "I was 15 when my father told me I'd marry Bo Avery," she continued, voice low, like something might crack if it rose too much. "Didn't ask me, just traded me like a mule or a sack of grain." The storm muttered outside. The wood in the stove snapped like it had opinions. June stared into the fire. "Bo was older, mean in the way that don't show on the outside. Folks thought he was quiet, but quiet ain't always kind, Mr. Bannon. You know that." Eli said nothing. His hands rested on his knees, knife and wood set down. "He didn't hit," she said. "Not often. He didn't have to. He was good at making me small with a glance, a word, making me scared of my own shadow, and when that didn't work, he locked me in the feed room overnight. Said it'd help me learn respect." She paused. The rain softened for a moment, like the night was holding its breath. "I tried to leave once. He broke my shoes. Said next time I'd go barefoot if I wanted the road so bad." Her eyes glinted in the firelight. "So I did." Eli leaned forward, elbows on his knees. It was snowing. I wrapped my feet in a flour sack and walked, didn't know where, just away. Didn't look back, not once. Never found Ma or Micah, my brother. Never knew if they made it. Her voice cracked on his name. Micah. She reached into her dress pocket and pulled out the small leather pouch she'd clutched that first day at Red Dust, opened it slow. Inside was a torn piece of fabric and red and frayed at the edges, and a bead shaped like a tiny buffalo, worn smooth by time. "Only things I got left," she said. "Of them. Of me." She looked up then, straight at Eli. "I never meant to bring trouble to your door." He met her eyes and saw no lie there, only someone who'd carried too much, too long. "You didn't," he said. "Just that." June blinked. That was all. Not forgiveness, not absolution, just truth. Clean and heavy. And for the first time, it didn't sting. Eli stood, walked to the cupboard, and poured 2 cups of tea. He handed one to her. June took it with both hands, holding it like something sacred. Outside, the rain slowed to a hush. Somewhere beyond the trees, a coyote howled once, then fell quiet. Inside, they drank in silence, not because there was nothing left to say, but because something had finally been said, and sometimes in the West, that was enough. Part 8. Deeds over Words. Come morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world wet and clean and oddly still. The land didn't thank you when the rain came. It just soaked it up and went on living. And in the high country, that was about the best a person could hope for. June rose early, earlier than Eli, earlier even than James, who liked to greet the horses before the rooster made up its mind. She stepped into the barn with her sleeves rolled and her boots muddied from the thawing yard. Her fingers were steady, her face calm. The truth had come out the night before, and though it hadn't changed the land or the weather, it had changed the shape of her breath, made it just a little easier to draw in. She found Eli's cartridge belt hanging on a nail by the workbench, leather cracked in 2 places, a stitching thread long gone. She touched it without asking. That was her way. Back inside, she dug into the chest under the cot, found an old saddlebag, the stitching strong but frayed. She cut it slow, careful not to waste more than she had to. She worked by the firelight, silent, sewing long into the morning. By noon, the belt was stitched strong and straight again, not pretty, not perfect, but it would hold bullets without spilling them, and that was the point. She left it on the bench where Eli would find it, said nothing. Instead, she fetched a skein of leftover yarn, the brown kind Mary never used, and began knitting a shawl. Her hands moved steady like they'd done it 100 times before. Maybe they had. Out by the chicken coop, Mary was chasing one of the stubborn hens with a stick. She dropped it when she saw June. "Want to try?" June asked, lifting the yarn with a faint smile. Mary hesitated, looked over her shoulder like she might be caught in something, then nodded. They sat on the back step. June showed her the loop, the twist, the way to count quiet between each row. The girl's hands were clumsy at first, but that was how learning worked. James watched from the barn where he was tying new knots on the gate latch. June walked over later and showed him a better way to loop the rope, one that wouldn't tighten too sharp on the horse's mouth. He didn't say thank you, but the way he nodded said plenty. That evening, Eli came in from clearing the fence line, boots thick with clay. He saw the cartridge belt on the table, ran his fingers over the new stitch. He didn't ask who did it, didn't need to. He stepped outside and returned a few minutes later with a small slab of pine. Took his pocket knife to it right there by the fire while the stew simmered. The kids watched him carve in silence. James leaned close, mouthing the letters as they took shape. The Bannon place. James. Mary. June. When he finished, Eli stood and walked outside, barefoot, as if he didn't feel the cold. He nailed the sign above the gate. The wood groaned a little, but it held. From the cabin window, June watched. Didn't move, didn't speak, but her shoulders, always pulled tight around the bones of old fear, dropped just enough, as if they no longer had to carry everything alone. Later, she walked out and stood beneath that sign, eyes lifted to read it like scripture. She didn't cry. She didn't need to. She turned and walked back inside, where the fire was warm and the stew smelled of garlic and thyme. The fourth teacup sat waiting on the table, not set aside this time, but placed with care like it belonged, because now she did. Part 9. Clay returns with a warning. The wind changed that week. It still came down from the ridge the same way it always had, skimming off the pines and bringing the chill into the valleys, but there was a bite to it now. Not just weather, something else in the air, something old that had turned itself around and started walking back toward them. June felt it first. She paused longer at the windows, let her hand linger too long on the latch. Her stitches grew tighter, her gaze slower, as if the peace she'd begun to believe in might not hold through the next gust. Then Clay Morrell rode in, not loud, not like the last time when the dust off his saddle stirred up old shame and fresh suspicion. This time he didn't say much at all when he dismounted, just tied his mare by the trough, ran his hand down her neck, and stood there for a minute like he wasn't sure he wanted to be the bearer of what he'd brought. Eli was fixing the water pump when he spotted him. "Clay," he said, quiet as always. Clay nodded. His hat stayed in his hands. "You got a minute?" he asked. They stood by the barn. June watched from the cabin, frozen mid-motion, kettle in her hand. The kids were out back, stringing yarn from the fence posts. To make a game June had shown them. They laughed, not knowing yet what it meant when grown men spoke low and didn't look each other in the eye. "I don't like saying it," Clay started, voice gravel thick, "but folks been seeing Bo down near Snake Wash, asking about a woman, dark hair, leather pouch. Said she ran north, said he'd find her." Eli didn't blink. Clay glanced at the cabin. He's been drinking less. Makes him sharper, meaner too. Eli wiped his hands on a rag and stared out at the line of hills. I figured you'd want to know, Clay said, voice dropping further. You ain't the only one with ghosts walking back through the door. Then he mounted up and rode off, never once looking back. That evening Eli laid out his tools. He cleaned the rifle first, slow and thorough, then checked the revolver, oiled both, retied the latch on the barn, and hammered a fresh iron loop into the gatepost. Didn't say a word. June saw it all from the window. She didn't ask, didn't flinch. She just folded the shawl across her lap and kept knitting. The fire crackled low. Steady, Mary lay curled with a book. James was polishing the saddle horn. The air smelled of onions and smoke. And June? June didn't hide. She didn't pack. She sat by the hearth, right in plain sight, her hands moving with rhythm and resolve. Because running only teaches fear how to chase you faster. But staying meant something had changed, that someone had drawn a line in the dust and said, "Here," no further. That night, as Eli locked the front door and placed the rifle by his bed, he looked once toward the chair by the fire. June sat there still, eyes steady, not on the flame, not on the shadows, but on the space where tomorrow would begin. Part 10. A Stranger in the Fog and the Boy Who Lived. The fog rolled in just before dawn, crawling low like a wounded thing across the land. It blurred the outline of the trees and made ghosts of the fence posts. The fields past the barn went pale and still, as if the whole of Crescent Hill Ranch was holding its breath, waiting. Eli didn't sleep much that night. He sat on the porch with the rifle across his lap, boots planted firm, coffee long gone cold. Inside, the fire murmured. The cabin was asleep mostly, except for June. She sat near the coals, her hands folded for once, as if the yarn had nothing more to say that night. She hadn't spoken since Clay's warning, but her silence wasn't the silence of fear. It was the kind that holds a line, gathers resolve, keeps the pieces of a past from scattering too far apart. The morning broke without light. Just that thick gray silence and the faint crunch of hooves, somewhere beyond the tree line. Eli heard it first. He rose, slow, shoulders moving like gates unlatched after a long winter. He stepped off the porch, moved through the fog, rifle held firm but not raised. Not yet. June came to the doorway, no shawl, no shoes, just her frame outlined against the warmth of the cabin's glow. Her hands clenched at her sides. A shadow moved near the barn. It was small, unsteady, not a man's weight, not a rider's posture. The shape wavered, then staggered. Eli didn't lower the gun, but he stepped forward. The fog thinned just enough for the outline to become real. A boy, half-starved, wrapped in a dirty coat 2 sizes too big. Fingers blue from cold. Around his neck, tied like a promise never broken, was a faded cloth, soft red, frayed at the edge. A piece of a woman's scarf, same weave June had once folded into her pouch. The boy looked up at Eli, eyes dull with exhaustion. He tried to speak, failed. Then he turned slightly and saw her. June. She didn't cry out. She didn't rush. She walked, barefoot, quiet, across the frost-cracked yard. When she reached him, she knelt. Her hand touched his cheek, then the cloth at his neck. He whispered something, one word, the way a prayer escapes a cold mouth. "Sis." That's when her knees gave, not from fear, not from shock, but from the weight of years carried too far, too long. She folded him into her arms like she'd never let go again. And for the first time in Eli's memory, he saw June cry. Not from pain, not from shame, but from something softer, something like return. The boy, her brother, had lived, escaped, like she had, wandered, survived, and now, by whatever twist of grace the wild allowed, he had found her. The fog didn't lift that day, not fully, but inside the cabin there was warmth again. Eli made a stew that sat long on the fire. Mary and James took to calling the boy Finn. He was small but quick, quiet but with eyes that missed nothing. And when night came, June tucked him beneath the wool blankets and sang something low, in a tongue Eli didn't know but understood just the same. It was a song for those who come back and for those who stay. Part 11. Building Fences, Not Walls. Spring came late that year, as if winter hadn't quite made peace with letting go. The frost still clung to the low ground under the trees, and the wind that swept across Crescent Hill Ranch had a bite in it. But there were patches of stubborn green pushing up through the earth, like hope rising where it didn't ask permission. The morning started with a quiet clatter, not of threat or trouble, but of tools. James stood on a stump, holding a bucket of nails too big for his hands. Mary wore Eli's old hat, one side caved in. Her sleeves rolled past the elbows like she meant business. She carried the hammer like it was a badge. And June? She walked the fence line barefoot in dew, her braid looped with a piece of cord, handing out sips of water and strips of dried apple between each post that went into the ground. Even Finn helped. He held the wire steady when Eli needed both hands, learning fast where to stand, how to pull with care, not force. Eli didn't say much. Didn't have to. He worked with the easy, quiet strength of a man who'd spent too many years patching things alone and now didn't mind being handed a nail by a small set of fingers. No one called it a chore. No one said the word family. But it was there in every motion, in the way James ran to grab the saw when Eli gestured, or how June gently wiped the splinter from Mary's palm with a mother's patience she didn't know she had. It was there in the way Finn leaned against June's side when she knelt to tie his shoe, one arm draped around her like it belonged. And it was especially there in the way Eli stood back when the last post was in, wiped his brow, and nodded once. He turned to June, handed her the small pocket knife he kept on his belt. "Want to mark it?" he asked, voice low, not pushing. She looked at him, really looked, then down at the beam, took the knife, thought a moment, and began to carve. Not her old name, not a letter from the past, just one word. "Here." The wood split slightly as the blade moved, but she worked slow, with purpose. When it was done, she ran her hand over it, soft as if smoothing the top of a child's head. The wind stirred, lifting the ends of her braid. The sun peeked through the thinning clouds, catching on the sweat of their arms, the shine of new wire stretched straight and strong. They didn't talk much afterward. June refilled the cups. Eli checked the gate. Mary wandered off to pick a few wildflowers near the well, and Finn followed, a stick in his hand pretending to be a sword. James sat beside the fence post, tracing the carved word with his finger. "Here," he whispered, like saying it made it more true. And maybe it did. Sometimes a place becomes yours not when you claim it, but when it finally accepts you. That night, June set her cup beside the fourth on the table without thinking. Eli didn't correct her. He poured the tea slow, let the steam rise between them like a kind of peace. There were no questions, no conditions, only that word carved in wood and the labor they'd shared. That was enough. Part 12. A family without needing to say it. The wind softened that evening, brushing low across the grass like it had been told to hush. Shadows stretched long across Crescent Hill Ranch, touching fence posts newly hammered, fading into the timbers of the old porch where 4 chairs now stood, not one too many, not one too few. Inside the cabin, supper had been quiet, the way it often was when the day had been good and tired, everybody out. No arguments, no big talk. Just the scraping of plates, the slow passing of bread, the clink of spoons, and that warm hush that settles when people no longer feel like strangers. James was the first to yawn. He leaned his head against June's shoulder without asking, without looking. She didn't move. Finn had already curled up on the rug near the hearth. A dog-eared book half slipped from his hand. Mary knelt beside him, tucking the quilt a little tighter around his legs, her movements practiced as if she'd always done it. Eli stirred the fire one last time. The glow rose, then settled. Then Mary stood up, her little journal clutched to her chest. "Can I read something I wrote?" No one answered, but no one needed to. She stepped out onto the porch, flipping through the worn pages. She sat down slow, cleared her throat once, then read. "It's about a woman," she said, "who didn't have a name when she got here. They called her a mountain woman, and she didn't talk much. She just worked. She helped when someone was sick. She didn't cry, even when folks looked mean. But then—" Mary paused, glanced toward June, who was still seated inside, eyes lowered but listening. But then someone gave her a name, a good one, and she stayed. Not because she had to, but because someone made room for her. Her voice cracked a little at the end. She closed the journal and wiped her cheek with her sleeve. June stepped out after a moment, not to say anything, but to place a hand on Mary's back. Just for a second. That was all. Eli poured the tea. June filled his cup before her own, and there, on that porch, with the sun sinking slow and red over the hills, they sat. No one said the word family. No one needed to. 4 people, 4 chairs, 4 steaming cups of tea, each one still warm. The last light caught the carving on the new sign above the porch. The Bannon place, James, Mary, June. The Bannon part wasn't just Eli anymore. Not really. June leaned back, the wooden spoon she'd whittled now resting beside the flower pot she and Mary had filled that week. The plant was small, but it held. The wind carried a scent of mesquite and of old pine. Not sharp. Familiar. June looked up at the stars, already starting to blink through the last of the day. She didn't say thank you. She didn't have to. Staying, truly staying, was the thank you. And Eli, he looked at her hand resting near his on the arm of the chair. He didn't reach for it. But he didn't pull away when hers drifted closer either. The porch creaked once beneath them, then all was still. Not the stillness of loneliness, the stillness of belonging, of being home. Some folks never get a second chance. Others don't even get a name. But every once in a while, someone places a 4th teacup on the table. And without asking much, say, "Stay as long as you need." Out here, kindness doesn't come loud. It's in the way a fence gets mended, or how a man carves a name into wood, just so a woman who was sold for $3 can finally call somewhere home. If this story sat with you a while, tell me, have you ever met someone who gave you a place without needing to know your past? I'll be reading every word you leave below the firelight.